96 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. was born. I want you to think about his legacy as you listen to the update, as things are moving very quickly in the world today, toward the potential to achieve the kind of peace that Dr. King dedicated his life to. For him, he was driven by an idea of peace not based on military power, but on love toward all human beings. And he didn't just speak about it. He lived a life of that kind of mentality, of that kind of fight. And he paid for it with his life. His life was taken by those who refused to give up the idea that power for the sake of acquisition is what life is all about. But that system of his opponents is grinding down. It's coming to an end. And the question now is, do we have the capability to achieve a new paradigm that's based on this conception of love toward all human beings? And that's what the battle is going to be as we see a new administration coming into power in Washington. We're not sure where President Trump is going and whether he has the team that's necessary to do it. But most importantly, he said he's ready to meet with Putin as soon as possible. And President Putin indicated that he would like to have that happen as well. That Putin said he's ready to meet with anyone, including the United States, for the purpose of mutual benefit and peace. But for that to happen, for the West to initiate it, it has to be based on putting an end to the ideology of geopolitics. And this is something Helga Zepp-LaRouche has emphasized repeatedly. And now we're seeing the recognition of many governments, of many countries, that the danger is the imperial geopolitics as a way of determining international relations. This was expressed recently in a speech by British Foreign Secretary Lammy, who said, look, now that the era of post-Cold War peace has ended, we need to have a military buildup. This was the whole discussion process at the Ramstein Air Force Base last weekend with the so-called Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which talked about how Europe has to have a bigger expenditure for defense in case Trump pulls back from the war against Russia. And so we're looking at, on the one side, the defenders of the unipolar order, those who reject the message of peace of Dr. King and instead see power through military force as the best way to ensure peace based on their continuing control. And that's the issue of geopolitics. And unfortunately, there are people in the so-called realist school who talk about peace, but still operate from the standpoint of peace means you have to have contending military blocs. This is what John Mearsheimer represents. And in a sense, an extension of the Kissinger school with the idea that you have to split apart Russia and China. But in fact, it was the alliance of Russia and China, especially consolidated prior to the beginning of the special military operation, which has been the biggest threat to the continuation of the unipolar order. Because the unipolar order survived on the basis of dividing nations against each other, of preventing any combination of nations that would act for a higher purpose, namely mutual benefit, mutual cooperation. And so we see the role of people like Blinken, who are continuing to operate from the standpoint of divide. Now, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in his New Year's address, spoke of a new type of association, what you see emerging with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS countries, BRICS Plus, but also the Eurasian perspective of President Putin. The idea that security is not primarily military issue, but that it's cooperation for economic development and collaboration. And that that's the way that you can achieve an undifferentiated peace. Lavrov said, we want to see all nations, including the U.S.-led collective West, interact based on respect for the interests of all their partners. And that's what the BRICS Plus represents. Those people who are saying, when will they dump the dollar? Are they going to be a countervailing military force? That's not their intent. Their intent is to redefine relations between nations based on not just mutual respect, but mutual commitment to development. And this is what Blinken is dedicated to stop. You may have seen his speech to the Atlantic Council, which was disrupted by demonstrators who were calling him Bloody Blinken and saying that he's for war, 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 war. Well, that's absolutely true. Blinken told this story about how he spent 9 hours with Netanyahu trying to convince him to allow more aid to get through to the Palestinians. And Blinken's line was, we need to have a more humanitarian approach to the situation in Gaza. And at the same time he said that, he was delivering new tranches of money and weapons, including the 2,000-pound bombs that were killing thousands of Palestinian children. And he was saying that we should be killing them in a more humane way. Well, this brings us to a crucial question, accountability. Now, I don't mean revenge, but I mean accountability as in the sense of holding people responsible who carried out these actions and supported these actions of genocide, for example, in Gaza. The people who are responsible for the provocations and the false flags and the lying that leads to these wars, they must be brought to account. But the way to do that is to end the way they think and operate. Put an end to the idea of geopolitics. That should be the goal of accountability. That we have to move away from the zero-sum game of we win, you lose, and instead enter into an era where everyone sees the benefit of the other as representing their own benefit, their own advancement. And that's what we can learn from Dr. Martin Luther King. And that's what we can learn from the non-aligned movement. This idea that you don't have competing power blocks, but nations that are working together, from adversaries to partners. That's the goal that has to be pursued. That's the goal of a new strategic and development architecture that Mrs. LaRouche has been talking about. Now, I'll be having the weekly dialogue with her today to discuss this. This will be at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And you're welcome to join and send us your questions and comments. You can send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org or send them to me, harleysch@gmail.com. And the topic of the discussion will be that we have a new president coming in next week, and then a month from now we'll have elections in Germany. That time period could be the period in which the wars are ended, as Trump has said he wants to do. The wars can be ended between the West and Russia and Ukraine, and the Gaza war of genocide by the Israelis. What potential would be opened up if those wars ended? Well, for one, just think about what you could have done with $200+ billion instead of using that to fight a war against Russia. Instead, invested in infrastructure, including major water projects like the NOAPA project, which I'll also be linking to the description today. NOAPA being something that President Trump essentially referenced when he talked about bringing water down from Canada. Instead of letting it run off into the Pacific Ocean, bring it down to fight fires and to actually green the desert in Southern California. That's what we should be doing. That's what Dr. King was talking about. And that's what the idea of win-win cooperation is. So to honor Dr. King, let's put an end to geopolitics. And be sure to join us today 11 a.m. Eastern, or it'll be archived so you can see it later when we have the weekly discussion with Helga Zepp-LaRouche.